Corruption scandal proves Ukrainians' anti-corruption bodies work. We'll talk about this with Jason Smart, American political strategist. Jason, glad to see you and thank you for joining us.
It's always great to see you.
Jason, European Commission spokesperson has said that recent investigations into corruption and the exposure of schemes involving senior officials have proved that Ukrainians' anti-corruption bodies are functioning. Reported by Guillaume Mercier during the press briefing. Jason, what do you think about this corruption scandal? How does the European Commission evaluate the effectiveness of Ukrainians' anti-corruption bodies based on these recent investigations?
I think, of course, everybody is surprised to see this nature of corruption, as large it is, as widespread as it was. But at the same time, we have to understand the context. The reason we know about that is because there are thorough and transparent investigations. And it's also law enforcement. These people are going to be charged with crimes. This is not something that's just a media headline, but something that's being taken seriously by the state. President Zelensky got ahead of the story, went out immediately and said that, he supports further investigation and prosecution of anybody involved in corruption. And it's very clear to Kiev that any sort of corruption right now is absolutely detrimental for its international message and the international good support and goodwill that it receives. But as a result of that, I think we can say that what is happening now is just simply that Ukraine is doing what it can to fight corruption. And these entities, such as NABU and the other ones, are effective. They're effectively going after those who break the law and enforcing the law.
Jason, a corruption scandal may hinder Ukrainians' EU accession and the transfer of frozen Russian assets, reported by La Repubblica. The Ukrainian investigation into hundreds of millions in bribes involving a system that was supposed to protect civilians from power outages has raised concerns in Europe, the Italian newspaper reports. The publication notes that this case only confirms the conclusions of the latest European Commission report on EU candidate countries, which states that Ukraine has made limited progress in combating corruption. How might this corruption scandal affect Ukrainians' prospects for EU accession? Could this scandal impact the planned transfer of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, in your opinion?
Absolutely. I mean, let's be honest, this is a very bad sign. It's a massive amount of corruption. But once again, the good part is that it's being prosecuted. It's being taken to its natural conclusion. It's not being hidden. It's not being covered up. And that's the most important thing. We can't change what has already occurred in the past, but we can look ahead what to do at this point. And at this point, there's a lot that Ukraine can do. And one part of that is publishing this, allowing the public to see and the international community that they are doing their best to fight corruption. Obviously, I think that everybody in Ukraine would like to see the full prosecution of these people who are engaged in these crimes. I can't imagine anybody would be sympathetic to these people. But yes, for Ukraine in the long term, one of the key conditions is that it fights corruption if it wishes to enter things like the EU or NATO. But that's something that today they have to take the steps necessary to make sure these sorts of events don't occur again.
And we wish to speak directly to the people of Europe. We understand that recent reports of corruption in Ukraine are deeply concerning. Please know that these scandals also sadden and hurt us as Ukrainians. However, all support and donations from abroad, from you, are directed solely to our defenders and those protecting our country, not to corrupt officials. Everyone involved in this major corruption scandal will be held accountable. We hope we're actively working to ensure justice and strengthen our anti-corruption efforts. So thank you for your continued trust and support during these challenging times for Ukrainians. Jason, quote, "We don't have many options left for new sanctions against Russia," reported by US State Department. Practically, there is almost nothing left that we can sanction. We have hit their largest oil companies. That's exactly what everyone had been calling for, Marco Rubio said after the meeting of G7 foreign ministers. According to him, the United States now intends to focus on enforcing existing sanctions and countering the shadow fleet that Russia uses to circumvent the restrictions. What specific measures will the US take to enforce existing sanctions more effectively? How is the US monitoring and countering Russia's shadow fleet operations?
That's always been the question, is we pass all sanctions, but if we don't enforce them, what's the point of them? So enforcement's got to be the central role. That's what we have to really be spending our time and energy on, and investigating different people, different companies that are engaged in trying to violate these rules and to go about supporting the Putin regime to continue enriching itself and to fight this war. Now, I think what's going to be the most interesting is what the U.S. does specifically with the Shadow Fleet. The U.S. does have the capacity as a naval power to actually board these ships, and there's plenty of legal grounds for that. I mean, these ships are operate without insurance. They don't have the correct fittings that they need to have. The crews are often untrained. But there's a lot of reasons that the U.S. could legitimately board these ships and check them out. And that would then allow us to prevent Russia to continue engaging in this trade. But it's unclear yet what Washington wants to do, what steps it's going to take. And I think we'll just have to wait for the next week or so to see what else comes out of Foggy Bottom.
Jason, are there any remaining sectors or entities in Russia that could still be targeted by new sanctions?
It's a good question. I never really thought about what more could be sanctioned because I think we have covered most everything at this point. That being said, I think that the biggest problem we've had so far is simply the lack of enforcement. To have these rules on the book, but if nobody cares about them, it's not going to change Russia's behavior. So what we need to do now is to really go after full throttle all the different people engaged in sanction violations.
Despite the White House's assertion that Hungary has been exempted from US sanctions against Russia oil companies for only 1 year, the Hungarian authorities continue to insist that the exemption is indefinite. Telex reports this. Hungarian Foreign Minister Patriciarto said on Thursday that the key issue regarding the exemption from US sanctions is the direct agreement between Hungary and the United States, not its formal written documentation. What do you think about this, and how long is Hungary planning to rally on this exemption, and are there any conditions for its continuation?
You know, it's unclear, but I would have to imagine that there's not going to be a long-term agreement. And I don't think that the U.S. would have promised that we will never make you abide by the sanctions. I'm pretty sure that's not the case, and that the foreign minister is simply making it up because the U.S., just as a state policy, typically does go for 1 year at a time on these extensions, like we saw in the case of Hungary before and in the case of Serbia, other countries. But I cannot imagine they just gave them a blanket waiver on this. It would just be very atypical of the way that Washington, D.C. works.
Chinese refineries increased oil imports from Saudi Arabia. In November, China significantly reduced its purchases of Russian oil, replacing it with crude from Saudi Arabia. Reuters reports these citizen tanker shipping data from KPLER. What do you think about this and about China?
Well, I mean, the role of China in all this is, of course, the big question. If China really does start to step further away from Russia, as it appears they are doing, in terms of buying less of their oil, using less of their refineries, same with India, if those two countries step away from Russia, then Russia really has some significant problems. Frankly, Russia sells about 80 to 85% of its oil to India and China. Now, keep in mind, it's about 45% of the Russian national budget comes from oil sales. So without that, what are they going to do? The Chinese, though, recently have shown that they're not very good friends of the Russians in the sense that look at the discounts they're seeking on every barrel of oil. The discounts are getting deeper and deeper, and that means for the Russian state, they're making less and less profit. But now, when you look at the fact that the Saudis appear to be trying to flood the market with their oil, it appears that the U.S. is supporting that to drive down the oil prices, something that I think that the U.S. administration likes for a couple of reasons. One being simply it allows prices to go down in the United States, and they'd like to see that. But secondly, it's something that it would allow American companies to sell more oil, something that they're also interested in doing. But I think that China's role in all of this is going to be key. Because if China really does get strict on this and decides that it's not going to continue buying Russian oil, that will be a major and a devastating blow for the Kremlin.
How significant is the increase in oil imports from Saudi Arabia compared to previous month? If you know, what impact might this shift have on global oil markets and Russian energy exports?
Well, Russia as a whole is very desperate to find more people to buy its oil. And it's going to have a real hard time doing that, given the fact that it's very limited to where it can bring the oil and how it can operate. But neither here nor there, it would appear at this point that China is going to be playing less of a role in buying Russia's oil. Now, Saudi Arabia also has its own long-term strategic interest that it shares with countries like China, which fit into this, which is a much more detailed conversation. But we have to understand that each one of these countries is operating in its own best interest, and it's not just about oil. Oil is one thing, but there's many other areas where they also cooperate, where they work together. And we have to look at all this as through that entire prism of different things, these different relationships, and not simply oil. It's not just so direct. And that's why I think that going ahead, for Russia, it's going to become harder and harder because outside of oil, they can't really offer very much. They can't give their allies something like security. They can't provide the best military technologies. There's very little that they can really give. And that's why for them, it's going to get harder. Whereas the Chinese, it's multifaceted. I mean, they have a very large economy. They have a lot of different things in technology, a lot of business opportunities. And that's why countries are much more interested to work with them. And countries like Saudi Arabia realize their value in that respect as well.
Could this trend in general indicate a long-term alignment of China's oil supply strategy?
Well, I think in the long term, what they're going to look for is to see where they can have a stable agreement. Now, I think that's probably going to be via other countries in OPEC that are very disappointed with Russia. Russia itself, keep in mind, is violating the OPEC plus limits because it is a cartel, obviously. They limit how much oil you can sell. And it's doing that because it needs to make more profit. Right now, it's simply giving out too deep of discounts. It can't afford to do that. So it has to sell more oil to make up for the money that it's losing. Now, because of this, I think that it's going to be very, very hard for the Russians to continue operating as they are. I just don't see where they're going to get more clients from or how they're going to be able to make up for the lack of hard cash liquidity, which their country so desperately needs in its banks and its overall system. The lack of foreign currency right now for Russia, they always are seeking euros and dollars as well as yuan from China. It's key. Without that, it's going to be very interesting to see how the Kremlin tries to pull this off.
And India. Russian oil flows to India, which rose sharply after Russia invaded Ukraine, will soon be reduced to almost zero. This will occur after the US imposes sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, according to Bloomberg. How will the US sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil affect Russia's oil exports to India? What timeline is expected for the reduction of Russian oil flows to India? And how is India preparing to replace the reduction in Russian oil imports?
Well, so keep in mind, all these different countries, China and India both, it's a similar situation. As I said, it's a mosaic of different considerations that they have. In the case of both countries, keep in mind, they're also trying to negotiate trade deals with the U.S. right now to have less tariffs on their goods. I have no doubt whatsoever, one aspect of that that's probably not published but is occurring, is that they say, listen, we're happy to cut you a deal. We'll buy less of the Russian oil. We'll buy it from a U.S. ally or from the U.S., or we'll work with American corporations, but in exchange, give us a lower tariff. Those countries are going to do what's good for their national economic interest. China and India both, it's more than 10% of their foreign trade is done with the U.S. In both countries' cases, it's less than 4% of their trade is with Russia. So there's simply much more trade and long-term economic interests to being well established with Americans than there are to be well established with the Russians.
We see that Russia's Black Sea port of Novorossiysk holds oil export after Ukrainian drone attack. The Russian Black Sea port of Novorossiysk suspended oil exports following a Ukrainian drone attack overnight on November 14th. Reuters reports this citing to industry sources. The sources also noted that Transneft has halted crude oil deliveries to the port. Transneft declined to comment. What is the potential impact on global oil prices if these attacks continue or escalate? Not only if we're talking about this attack, could repeated attacks on oil infrastructure lead to long-term changes in sanctions or energy policy? How do you think?
Well, I consider attacks on the Russian oil industry to be a form of sanction enforcement. It's making sure that the Russians can't do anything more that's going to violate sanctions if you destroy their oil industry. So I think it's a very positive move. Overall, no, I don't think it'll affect the prices globally, just because it's not really operating the normal market. But beside that, I think that, as I said, for Russia as a whole, if we look at, we try to analyze where their money is, how their economy breaks down, it becomes very clear that they really need the oil. So let's look at this. Consider this detail. Vladimir Putin's Minister of Energy is a relative of his, and it's in fact the husband of the current Deputy Defense Minister, who is his cousin, or niece actually, to be exact. He's appointing more and more of his friends and families to these sorts of senior positions. So you would wonder, why does he have one over at the Ministry of Defense and the other one over here at the Ministry of Energy? And it's simple. It's because ultimately that's where the most amount of money in Russia is, and they're trying to embezzle as much as they can, as quickly as they can, right now while they have the opportunity to do so. So I think for Russia, we have to think of this a little bit more outside the box than just to think about the prices of oil. We have to think about what is their actual concern and their objectives. And in the case of the Kremlin, their objectives are very often not those that you would associate with a normal state policy-making process. They're rather the objectives that serve very specific people and their own economic interest at senior levels of the Kremlin.
we're talking a lot about sanctions, and also I want to talk about next news that President Volodymyr Zelensky called on European allies to overcome disagreements regarding the use of Russia's frozen assets, stating the new funding is critically important for the economy of a war-affected country to sustain its fight against Moscow. So are there alternative sources of funding if EU allies cannot reach a consensus quickly? What impact would delays or lack of agreement have on Ukrainians' ability to continue resisting Russian aggression?
I don't think it'll affect it. I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of different plans and contingency plans, but I don't think that it will affect Ukraine's ability to fight off Russia. I think that everybody understands the strategic interests of that and what's to be gained in that, even if it's selfish in nature. But that's why I don't think anything's going to change. I would not worry about that.
And also, we see that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said the United States has launched the military operation Southern Spear near Venezuela. The order was issued by US President Donald Trump. The operation aims to combat narco-terrorists in South America. In recent months, relations between Venezuela and the United States have significantly deteriorated. US forces have repeatedly attacked boats off the Venezuelan coast that were allegedly transporting narcotics. So we need to explain to our audience what is happening.
So there's a lot of different reasons of why it's actually occurring. One is that I think that they're looking at the electoral map, and there's Republican seats that look like they could lose in Florida, which have large Hispanic populations, namely Cuban descent. And those people, the Republicans believe that there's a bet they can make that by toppling one of these regimes that's associated with the Cuban regime, it's something that would boost the popularity in the Cuban community, which should shore up those seats. And why that matters is states like Florida are very, very important for the Electoral College. So I actually think there's a political strategy behind this. But aside from that, it's important to note about the Maduro regime itself is that there's, going back years and years, many, many warrants for his arrest. And each one of those is millions of dollars. But the reason that the Americans are against him for well over a decade is not because he's an autocrat. They don't like that, but that's not the major reason. The major reason is because he's the top exporter of cocaine in the world. And it's important to note that Venezuela, which is a close ally of Russia, works with the enemies of the United States to export this cocaine. What a lot of people, I think, do not understand is the fact that today, Venezuela is a sanctioned state. Russia is a sanctioned state. So they have something in common. Iran is a sanctioned state. But they also work with de facto sanctioned organizations like Hamas or Hezbollah. But why Hezbollah? Why is Hezbollah in Venezuela? Well, they're very good at washing money. So think about this. If you're a drug cartel, one of the things that you need is, or you have a lot of, is cash. But sanctioned states, they need cash, but they have banks. So you can wash the money via their banks. It works out for everybody. One gets cash, the other one gets money in the bank instead of just having rooms full of cash. And the terrorist organizations that we see working globally, they, in fact, participate in this process. In fact, look at Hezbollah and its role in Latin America. It's one of their top areas of the world is Latin America. They're very active there. Iran is very active there. And Venezuela is a key player in all of this. It's a keystone because it has become just such a narco state, totally devoid of rule of law, that it today is something that is cooperating directly with Russia and Hezbollah, as well as Iran and others, to go against the United States' security interest.
Jason, thank you so much for this interview. We sincerely appreciate your time and insights during the interview. And to say that Jason Smart, American political strategist, was with us today. Thank you so much for supporting Ukraine, and see you.
Thank you.